No one expected it, not even his closest cardinals. The Catholic world was still reeling from the election of Leo XIV, a pope from the end of the world, as he himself had said, Argentine by birth, but with a heart already set ablaze by the Brazilian peripheries he had visited years before as an auxiliary bishop. It was his first international trip as Supreme Pontiff. The destination? Many bet on Rome, Jerusalem, or perhaps Assisi. But the world watched, astonished, when he appeared on the balcony of St. Peter's Square with a firm gaze and declared, "My first decision as Pope will be made before Our Lady of Aparecida. I choose Brazil." The silence in the square turned to disbelief, then applause, and soon the entire world was asking, why Brazil? That same night, social media erupted. Brazilian Catholics were crying, deeply moved. Journalists tried to interpret. Theologians searched for precedents. But the poor, oh, the poor, they understood in their hearts what reason could not yet explain. The new pope wanted to look into the eyes of the mother, and he wanted to do it from the most unexpected place. It wasn't just a trip, it was a gesture, a sign, a calling, and Brazil had been chosen. He did not choose the great cathedrals of Europe, nor the symbolic ruins of the Holy Land. He chose the sanctuary hidden in the heart of a wounded country, a country marked by inequality, but burning with faith. That sentence, "I choose Brazil," wasn't part of a geopolitical strategy. It was the whisper of a shepherd who had heard something from heaven. It was spiritual guidance, not a diplomatic move. The Church was on the move, not toward the centers of power, but toward the outskirts of grace. And in that one phrase, the Pope had already placed his pontificate under the mantle of Mary, Brazilian, dark-skinned, barefoot, and carried in the arms of the simple. The next morning, all the world's news anchors repeated one word, Aparecida. But in heaven, what echoed was another word, Mother. It wasn't just about geography or sentiment. Behind that phrase, "I choose Brazil," there was something more profound, something sacred, a presence, an image. In a small room in the Vatican a few days before the public announcement, Pope Leo XIV had spent time in prayer before a tiny replica of Our Lady of Aparecida. It wasn't a grand statue. It wasn't made of gold or ivory. It was a simple black Marian image, cracked, modest, worn by time, just like the people she watches over. He had carried that replica for years. It had been a gift from a poor woman in Sao Paulo. "For your protection," she had said. He hadn't forgotten her face, nor the tears in her eyes. And now, seated before that little statue, he repeated out loud, "Mother, guide me." He closed his eyes, and the memories came. The processions, the pilgrims walking barefoot, the boys carrying rosaries, the mothers asking for healing, the elderly whispering the Hail Mary with trembling lips. He had seen it. He had breathed that faith, and now it called to him again. It wasn't politics. It wasn't a marketing strategy. It was Mary, more than devotion. It was trust. It was the certainty that if he began his pontificate at her feet, he would not walk alone. He wanted his first act to be small, but firm, human, but divine, Brazilian, but Marian. The next morning, he called a private meeting with his secretary and closest collaborators. "Holy Father, have you decided your first official trip?" The Pope nodded, then smiled. "Yes, I'm going to Aparecida." A silence fell over the room. One priest crossed himself. Another whispered, "Thank you, Lord." Then the Pope took the little image of Our Lady from his desk and kissed her feet. The Church was about to walk barefoot, but toward heaven. The decision was made. The plans began. And in heaven, a mother smiled. The Vatican was not prepared. When news of the Pope's destination leaked to some internal circles, murmurs began. Some called it imprudent, others too emotional. There were even those who feared political interpretations, but Pope Leo XIV remained serene. He listened, but did not retreat. "This is not about diplomacy," he told one of his aides. "It's about the heart of the gospel." And so it was. Every detail of the trip was being prepared with reverence. But what no one could control was what began to happen in the souls of the people. Even before his arrival, Brazil was already moved. Thousands of Brazilians began to organize prayer groups, novenas, and vigils. The national media camped out in Aparecida, and in the favelas and rural chapels, people whispered, "The Pope is coming to us." It wasn't Rome opening its doors to the poor. It was the poor who would open their hearts to the Pope. Meanwhile, in the Vatican, a cardinal approached him discreetly and asked, "Holy Father, are you sure you want to begin your pontificate this way?" The Pope's eyes filled with tears. He didn't answer immediately. He reached into his cassock pocket and took out a rosary. It was old, wooden, and slightly broken. "This rosary belonged to a boy I met in the outskirts of Recife. He gave it to me after Mass and said, 'Pray for me when you become Pope.'" A pause, a sigh. "I owe him this visit. I owe it to his faith." The cardinal bowed his head, and that day the entire papal office began to prepare itself, not just logistically, but spiritually. Some Vatican employees, who had never heard of Aparecida, began reading its history. Others, moved by the Pope's humility, asked to join the pilgrimage. Bishops across Latin America sent messages of support, and even critics began to recognize something great was about to happen. It was no longer just a journey, it was a spiritual earthquake. The successor of Peter was walking not toward thrones, but toward the benches of a humble sanctuary, and each step toward Brazil was a step into the mystery of a church that still knows how to kneel. The day had arrived. The plane of Pope Leo XIV crossed the Atlantic like a silent prayer. Every minute of the journey was wrapped in expectation. Pilots, flight attendants, security, all felt that this was not just another mission. It was history being written in real time. As the aircraft descended over the hills of São Paulo, the Brazilian people were already at the windows, on rooftops, in the streets. Many carried images of saints. Others held candles, flags, or children on their shoulders. But most carried something invisible, hope. When the plane touched down and the door opened, a breath seemed to pass through the entire country. He stepped out. No crown, no lavish garments. Just white, just a cross on his chest, and a gaze that searched for the people, not for cameras, not for applause, but for souls. And then he did something that no protocol had anticipated. He knelt. He knelt on the hot Brazilian ground, made the sign of the cross, and whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for bringing me home." The cameras tried to capture it. The journalists stumbled over words, but the people, they understood. He wasn't just visiting Brazil, he was embracing Brazil. From the airport, he was taken in a simple car, no bulletproof glass, no luxury, just an open window from which he waved and smiled. In the traffic jams of São Paulo, people ran alongside the vehicle. Some cried, others shouted blessings. Many simply looked in silence, overwhelmed by something sacred. The Pope asked the driver to slow down. He wanted to see, to feel, to receive. Children threw flowers. Elderly people extended their hands. At a certain moment, a young woman shouted, "We love you, Holy Father." He turned to her and replied, "It is your love that brought me here." That day, the newspapers would headline, "The Pope walks among us." But what they didn't write, what they couldn't write, was that millions of hearts were returning to the church that day, because they saw in the Pope a father, and in his tears the love of a God who never forgets his people. It was early morning in Aparecida. A gentle mist rested over the sanctuary like a veil of reverence. The bells had not yet rung, but the people were already there, thousands of them, praying in silence, barefoot, many holding photos, rosaries, letters. Some had walked for days. Others had come from the other side of the world, but all waited for one moment, his arrival. And when he came, it was not as a head of state, it was as a pilgrim. Pope Leo XIV did not arrive with ceremony. He walked slowly, silently, from the entrance of the city to the doors of the basilica. He wanted to feel every stone, every gaze, every sigh of the poor who had come before him. He walked among them. A woman reached out and touched his sleeve. A child was lifted into his arms. A disabled man wept in his wheelchair as the Pope knelt beside him. No one was rushed. No one was pushed away. Every encounter mattered. When he finally reached the steps of the national shrine of Our Lady of Aparecida, he removed his shoes. Yes, the Pope entered barefoot, and in that gesture, the whole church saw something beyond words: humility walking toward holiness. The interior of the basilica was already flooded with candles, songs, and tears. As he processed toward the altar, he didn't look to the crowd, nor to the cameras. His eyes were fixed only on one thing: her, Our Lady, the dark-skinned Virgin, the broken yet crowned image, the small statue that had united a people and now welcomed the successor of Peter. And when he stood before her, he paused. For a long moment, he said nothing, just looked. Then he bowed. Then he knelt. Then he wept, not as a pope, but as a son. There were no grand speeches, no fanfare, only the sacred silence of one heart finding refuge in another. And then he whispered, "I entrust my pontificate to you, Mother. Do with me as you did with Jesus. Form me." That day heaven opened in Aparecida, and the church, scattered across continents, found itself gathered again, not around power, but around a mother who never left the poor. The basilica was full, yet silent. So many voices, hearts, stories, and pains had gathered there, and still a sacred stillness reigned. It wasn't just a papal mass. It wasn't just a celebration. It was a consecration of an entire people and of the entire world under the gaze of a mother. The liturgy began. No fireworks, no spectacle, only reverence. The Pope wore a simple chasuble, hand-embroidered by a group of women from Ceará. On the front, the face of Our Lady of Aparecida. On the back, a cross made of tiny seeds, symbols of Brazil's fertile faith. As he ascended to the altar, he looked as if he were climbing Calvary, carrying the hope of millions. In his homily, he did not preach about ideologies. He didn't mention statistics or global issues. Instead, he spoke to the heart. Blessed is the people who still know how to cry before God. Blessed is the land where the poor still carry rosaries in their hands. Blessed is the church that learns from mothers, from workers, from children, the true theologians of the streets. He paused. Then, looking at the image of Our Lady, he continued, "I begin my pontificate not from Rome, but from the feet of a woman, because I believe the church needs to learn again how to serve, like Mary." And then came the moment that would mark history. Before the final blessing, he asked that a special consecration be made, not just of Brazil, but of the entire papacy to the protection of the Virgin of Aparecida. He walked down from the altar, approached the image, and placed a white rose at her feet. Then, before all, he prayed, "Mother of the poor, I give you everything, my hands, my heart, my voice, my years. Lead the church where your Son desires. And if I falter, lift me up, as you always have lifted your children." That moment was broadcast live to dozens of countries, in villages in Africa, in prisons in the Philippines, in chapels in Eastern Europe. People watched in tears. They weren't watching a leader. They were witnessing a son surrendering to a mother, and that made all the difference, because leadership without humility is tyranny, and authority without love is noise. But a pope on his knees is a bridge between heaven and earth. After the Mass, as the faithful poured out into the streets, chanting hymns and wiping tears, the Pope did not return immediately to the Vatican residence prepared for him. He had one more stop, one more wound to touch, one more gospel to live. He asked to visit a shelter on the outskirts of the city, a place that housed abandoned elderly, the sick, the forgotten. It was not on the official agenda. It had no cameras, no stage, no applause, just pain, just people, just the gospel. The car entered a dusty alley. The driver was unsure, but the Pope insisted, "This is where I want to go." The nuns who ran the shelter didn't believe their eyes. Some wept. Others covered their mouths in shock. The residents, many bedridden, didn't understand what was happening. But as he walked in, everything changed. He didn't greet them from a distance. He sat. He embraced. He listened. He kissed a blind man's forehead. He held the hand of a woman who hadn't spoken in years. He smiled at a boy with cerebral palsy and told him, "Your joy heals the world." At one point, a resident asked in a trembling voice, "Holy Father, why did you come here?" He answered without hesitation, "Because this is where Jesus hides." That line would never make headlines, but it would echo in eternity. The Pope stayed for over an hour. He prayed with them. He asked them to bless him. Yes, he knelt before them, and one by one the forgotten laid their hands upon his head. That day, theology was not taught in universities. It was whispered in the silence of wounds. It was proclaimed in the broken smile of a grandmother who, for the first time in years, felt seen. And the Church remembered, our Saviour was not born in a palace. He was born in a stable. He walked among the sick. He touched lepers. He made his throne on a cross, and now his vicar was doing the same. After days in Brazil, Pope Leo XIV knew he had one last act to fulfill before returning to Rome. He requested a meeting with the seminarians and young religious from all over Latin America. The location: a simple, open-air amphitheater near the sanctuary of Aparecida. No air conditioning, no microphones with echo effects, just wooden benches, sun and silence. Over 3,000 young men and women came, some by bus, others on foot. Many had never left their towns. Now they sat face to face with the Pope, but he didn't come as a lecturer. He came as a father. When he entered, he was greeted with music and applause. He smiled, waved, but quickly asked for silence. And then, with the tone of someone who had walked the roads of faith and stumbled on them too, he began, "You are not entering the priesthood or religious life to be functionaries of a sacred company. You are not called to be managers of sacramental machines. You are called to be fire." The air grew heavy. The young leaned forward. The Church does not need stars. She needs saints. She does not need administrators of tradition. She needs witnesses. She does not need influencers. She needs prophets. And then, almost whispering, he added, "If you're here just to wear a cassock or gain moral authority, please go home. But if you're here because you can no longer live without Christ, because he has ruined you for the world, then welcome. Let's suffer and rise together." Many wept. Others looked down, shaken. The Pope was not offering comfort. He was offering a cross. And they embraced it. After that speech, no one rushed for photos. There were no autographs, just a long silence, followed by prayer. That afternoon, something changed. Not just in them, but in the air. The kind of change that heaven notices. Because when the Church stops producing celebrities and starts forming saints, history bends. And from that dusty amphitheater in Brazil, a fire began to spread again, toward the seminaries, the convents, the missions, and the future of a Church that remembered. It was not made for comfort, but for conversion. His trip was coming to an end. The farewell Mass had already been celebrated, the meetings completed, the formalities signed. The Pope was expected to return to Rome that same evening, but before boarding the plane, Pope Leo XIV requested a private moment. No entourage, no photographers, just him and the statue of Our Lady of Aparecida. The basilica was already closed, the lights dimmed. The sacred image stood silent in her niche as she had for generations. When the Pope entered, he was alone with heaven. He slowly climbed the sanctuary steps, barefoot, step by step, like a son returning home. At the top, he knelt and placed both hands on the marble. Then he rested his forehead at the foot of the image and whispered, "Mother, I am afraid." No one heard it, no one recorded it, but that phrase would become a secret shared only between a pope and a queen. He remained like that for long minutes, silent, fragile, human. And it was then, In that silence, that something extraordinary happened. A single tear rolled down his face. It was not a tear of weakness, but of surrender, not of despair, but of confidence. The tear of a man who had seen the weight of the world and chose to offer it into the hands of a woman who once said yes to God with trembling lips and an unshakable heart. That tear reached heaven. In that moment, something invisible changed in the church, because a pope had wept before Mary, and the church once again became small, humble, maternal, tender, just like her. When he stood up, his face looked different, lighter, stronger, brighter. He made the sign of the cross, whispered his last prayer, and walked down the steps like someone who had left behind his fear and picked up a mission. Back in the car, he smiled. "Now, I'm ready," he said. And in heaven, Mary smiled back. The plane lifted off Brazilian soil. Millions had followed every moment, from the grand basilicas to the humble chapels, from cities lit with spotlights to villages where people gathered around a single radio. But something beyond politics, media, or ceremony had taken root. For the first time in centuries, the beginning of a pontificate was not marked by a proclamation in Latin from a Vatican balcony. It was marked by a whispered phrase in Portuguese at the feet of a dark-skinned virgin, "I choose Brazil." And that choice would not be interpreted as favoritism. It would be seen with time as prophetic, because Brazil, with its contradictions and wounds, its saints and its struggles, had become a mirror of the universal church. A church that bleeds but does not die, that weeps but does not despair, that stumbles but rises, that sins but confesses. A church still capable of believing in miracles. And Pope Leo XIV had not come to offer answers. He had come to listen. He had not preached political theories. He had knelt before the poor. He had not promoted reforms. He had embraced the original fire of the gospel. And in doing so, he reminded the world that true reform does not begin in documents, but in hearts, especially the heart of a shepherd who dares to be small again. The world had seen popes begin with thrones, crowns, and splendor. This one began on his knees, not by accident, but by design. Because perhaps, just perhaps, the greatest strength of the Church is not in her cathedrals or her doctrines, though both are treasures, but in her capacity to become childlike again, to let herself be led again, to rediscover her first love. And if the Pope began by placing everything in Mary's hands, then maybe we too can start there. Today, now, let us place our lives, wounds, sins, and dreams at her feet. Let us allow ourselves to be re-evangelized. Let us learn again to say, like her, "Behold the servant of the Lord," because the Pope may have chosen Brazil, but Mary has chosen you.